I'm just taking a minute before the formal introduction to say a few words. I'm calling this the preface to an ending. So it goes like this. I want to say thank you to you, first of all, for being such a great audience and such a flexible one. We've had a very peripatetic kind of session this semester, and you've all really hung in there, and I want to say thank you. The other person I want to say thank you to is our speaker tonight, because we owe him a very deep debt of gratitude. About a year ago, 3 members of the committee and I met with Sean for lunch one day. We wanted to pick his brain, which is considerable, and ask him to help us set up this program for the 75th anniversary year. So not only did he brainstorm with us, he made up a list of colleagues from the university. He wrote them a personal letter inviting them to join us for this series, and now he's back here to help us finish it off in style. So I want to thank Sean very, very deeply for helping us, and to give him a first edition of a Princeton Adult School t-shirt.
Welcome to meetings in the hall next week and I'll wear it.
The series we've had, we're very proud of. It's been a star-studded year with very, very special scholars and experts and people who've given us insights into the way our world has evolved over the last 75 years. So it is with very deep and sincere gratitude that I thank Sean for helping us put this together, for being so helpful at the beginning and bringing it to a close tonight. So thank you all, and John Burkhalter will now do the formal introduction.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Burkhalter, and I serve as a member of the board of the Princeton Adult School and a member of the lecture committee. Sean Willans studies U.S. social history and political history. He received his PhD in history from Yale University after earning degrees from Columbia and the University of Oxford. Author of numerous books, Chant Democratic, which won several national prizes, including the Albert J. Beveridge Award of the American Historical Society. Professor Willans is also the co-author and co-editor of The Key of Liberty and the editor of several other books, including Major Problems in the Early Republic and The Rose and the Briar, a collection of historical essays and artistic creations inspired by American ballads. He has written The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, which received the Bancroft Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Other books are The Age of Reagan, A History, 1974-2008, a reconsideration of U.S. politics since the Watergate affair, and Bob Dylan in America, a consideration of Dylan's place in American cultural history. Professor Willans is a contributing editor to numerous publications, The New Republic, a member of the editorial boards of Dissent and Democracy. He has lectured frequently and has written score upon score upon score upon score of articles, reviews, and opinion pieces for publications such as the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, the American Scholar, The Nation, Le Monde, and Salon. His writings on music have earned him a Grammy nomination and a Deems Taylor ASCAP Award. In his spare writing time, he is historian in residence at Bob Dylan's official website, www.bobdylan.com. In October 2012, Chronicle Books published Professor Willans' book, 360 Sound, The Columbia Records Story, an illustrated history of the world's oldest recording company. He has begun work on a new project, a reconsideration of the anti-slavery movement in the United States. Professor Willens teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in U.S. history here at Princeton University, focusing on the 19th century. He has taught courses on American literature and 20th century American culture and politics. This evening, Professor Willens will address politics in the United States since 1939. Actually, 75 for 75. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sean Willens to the podium.
That's on. That's good. There are no faint hearts in Princeton tonight. See that? It's astounding to see you all here tonight. This is maybe the nastiest night of all. I mean, when we planned this so long ago, I said, well, she said first the winter time, and I'm so happy that we planned it for the springtime. When it would be end of April. It would be a nice, warm, balmy night. I'm not going to make a joke about the weather. It's too depressing. Anyway, it's great to be here. I haven't lectured at the school for too long a time, so it's a special pleasure. It was a special pleasure to be invited to help out with putting this thing together for now, to help conclude it. It really is a special pleasure for me to be all here tonight. I chose as my topic, well, I mean, this is the 75th anniversary, so the question was, you know, what do you know about what happened over the last 75 years? Basically what the topic was. And I decided to do something about politics. I could have done music, I could have done a lot of things, but I decided to do politics. It's a political year, I'm very interested in American politics, but I do think that there's a way in which what's happening in American politics, or rather what's going on today in American politics, with all the complaints about polarization, all the difficulties about breakdown, all the rest of it, really can only be understood by taking a look back, a hard look back at the politics of the last 75 years. And as historians do, instead of trying to figure out what big thing happened, or rather what big thing was invented, what big thing was discovered, to rather look for turning points. To look at those moments when it could have gone this way, but it went that way. And it zigged when it should have zagged, or could have zagged. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Over the past 3/4 of a century, the United States has lived through two distinct political eras. One of which the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the Age of Roosevelt, the other of which, announced earlier, I have called the Age of Reagan. Age of Roosevelt, Age of Reagan. Let me hasten to say that in labeling these eras with the name of a president, neither Schlesinger nor I intended to revive the great man theory of history. FDR hardly appears in long stretches of Schlesinger's uncompleted history of the New Deal. Reagan is it's very important, but is hardly omnicompetent in my own writing. But the names do, I think, help emblemize different approaches to government and to the uses of government, and especially federal power, to redress social injustice, stabilize economic volatility, and, in the Constitution's words, promote the general welfare. Two very different approaches. In 1939, the United States had reached a key marking point, which set off one phase of the Roosevelt age from another. From 1933, when it began, through 1938, the New Deal had advanced from emergency action to enacting lasting social legislation such as the Social Security and Wagner Labor Relations Acts, only to be stymied by its own overreaching, and by the election of what would become a solid alliance of Southern segregationist Democrats and Midwestern Main Street Republicans in 1938, an alliance that would prove a powerful adversary to reform for decades, and whose remnants remain very much with us. With the storm clouds over Europe eventually thundering into World War II, Roosevelt prepared to take up a new mantle, calling himself Dr. Win the War. But the Rooseveltian age outlasted FDR as a combination of bipartisan Cold War consensus and a general acceptance by the dominant forces within the Republican Party of the New Deal's reforms overrode the backlash that arose in a variety of ways, from the passage of the Taft-Hartley bill, for example, to the rise and brief heyday of Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. The Civil Rights Movement, generated in no small degree by the experience of the war, widened the imperatives and opportunities for reform, eventually pushing a Democratic Party long hampered by its schizophrenic alliance of Northern liberals and Southern segregationists into an embrace of racial equality. The combination of civil rights reform and reinvigorated hopes for a New Deal to strengthen Roosevelt's achievements and to complete the unfinished business of the 1930s paved the way for Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty programs from exactly 50 years ago. That was the first era. The second conservative era, which was to last at least as long as the first, and some would argue still continues, formally began in 1968 with the election to the presidency of Richard M. Nixon. Although hardly a right-wing conservative, Nixon introduced policies that in some ways continue the spirit of the Great Society. He established the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, his administration, but in other ways, especially in civil rights, marked a retrenchment. Nixon's political crimes, though, in time paved the way for the election of Ronald Reagan, who truly did represent what had become an ascendant Sun Belt-led GOP right wing. Reagan proved far shrewder and more pragmatic than most of his adversaries and even many of his admirers thought he was, or at least expected him to be. His dealings with Mikhail Gorbachev, for example, in bringing the Cold War sort of to an end, it may be back again. It showed him to be very different, in fact, from what his own people thought he'd become Howard Phillips called him a stooge of the Kremlin, a useful idiot for the Kremlin, was Ronald Reagan. Many of the signature programs from the Great Society remained intact, despite what he was talking about, not just Medicare and Medicaid. It was under Ronald Reagan that the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized. It would take the Supreme Court to undo the Voting Rights Act, or got it anyway. Still, Reagan's presidency brought a great reversal of the Roosevelt era's assumptions about the government's role in securing the common social and economic welfare. A reversal which has had as its most abiding achievement the incomplete but still vast undoing of progressive federal income taxation. It ushered in a long period of conservative government that, though resisted, modified, and temporarily reversed in the 1990s, continued at least through the George W. Bush administration. Well, what happened thereafter, and what kind of era we're in now, we can leave for later discussion. My only point really is that there were these two distinct eras after 1932, including the last 75 years, and that the change from one to the other took place in and around 1968. Those of us who are old enough, and I think it includes everybody in this room from what I can see, will recall that in 1964, for example, President Johnson, modeling himself on FDR, could commend a candidate for the Senate in New York. I actually heard him say this in Brooklyn in 1964, commended Robert Kennedy as a fighting liberal. We can remember a time when it seemed, after LBJ's crushing of Barry Goldwater in that fall's election, that the forward march of liberalism, begun in 1933, would go on forever, whether we liked it or not. Practically all of us also know, though, that inside of 20 years, liberalism had become anathema, to the point where the very word sounded, in electoral politics anyway, like an epithet, the L word. An association so potent that today even many liberals will not call themselves liberals. They call themselves progressives, which those of us of a certain age also wonder about because progressives then meant leftists rather than liberals. So things are very confused. When did it all change? How did it all change? I would like to propose that although 1968 was in fact a great turning point, the really important shift occurred not with any one event, but with a series of events that occurred in 1963 and 1964. Incidentally, if any of you have seen the play All the Way, you really ought to. It's an extraordinary play. It's about Lyndon Johnson well, in fact, it's exactly what I'm going to be talking about tonight. If you want to see this talk performed on stage, much better than I could possibly do, go see it. It's a really, really fine production. It's historically very, very compelling, I think. Anyway. But it runs from the assassination of President Kennedy on November 22, 1963, through Johnson's election almost a year later. A year of extraordinary importance, one which at once marked the culmination of the first era the age of Roosevelt, but with turns of events that forecast, although very few people could see it at the time, the doom of that era. Behind this discussion tonight lurks, I think, a larger historical paradox that I would like you to consider. That sometimes what appear to be the moments of greatest triumph for a particular political current, political party, political movement, political idea, are also the moments when the seeds of disaster are beginning to grow, soon to blossom. The moments of triumph order the great defeat. The murder of President Kennedy, like all historical traumas, has been the source of endless debate, what-if debates. Above all, had Kennedy lived, would the United States have been engaged, as it would do, in Vietnam, or would JFK have withdrawn before going much further than he had? There's no way of knowing this. I've heard compelling arguments on both sides. Sometimes, depending what day it is, I suppose, I think one or the other. But there are, I think, certain things that are pretty clear about what was going on in the Kennedy administration on November 22nd, 1963. First, there was the Kennedy administration's embrace of civil rights reform, which I think had taken a decisive turn in late 1963, and in the middle of 1963 on, that was unlikely to change. The escalation of the civil rights struggles in 1962 and 1963, leading in fact to the integration of the University of Alabama, spearheaded by a great Princetonian, my dear friend, the late Nick Katzenbach, had led in fact to Kennedy's historic televised part of the question address on June 11th, 1963, after the integration of the University of Alabama. And if I can do this, it's going to be a miracle. I am going to do it.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if in short he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
That was the starkest statement on race relations which any president of the United States has delivered since Abraham Lincoln. And although there are still meager results, the Civil Rights Bill is still pending as of November 1963. There's no question that at the Justice Department, as well as at the White House, a different course had been charted on civil rights. A course that would take the administration through the murder of Medgar Evers, which occurred only hours after the speech was concluded, through the March on Washington and the Birmingham church bombings. Would it have been enough to get the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964? Probably not. That would require the combination of Lyndon Johnson's skills and the shock, really, the martyrdom of John F. Kennedy. But if we look ahead to the election of 1964, even though Kennedy's polls were down on November 22nd, 1963, they were down to about 60%. Pretty enviable for today. He would have run almost undoubtedly against Barry Goldwater. Had John F. Kennedy lived, we have to wonder whether, well, he would have creamed Goldwater. I'm very convinced of that. It would have been an interesting campaign. It would have been an enlightening campaign. But we have to wonder whether he and the Democrats would have won the kind of majorities that came about in 1964, which would have opened the way to civil rights reform. So it may have been later, but I think it probably would have happened down the line. Still, Dallas happened. A new president came into office, lacking the smoothness, lacking the grace, lacking the eloquence of John F. Kennedy. He was not, though, one of the segregationist diehards. Lyndon Johnson did not sign the notorious or famous, depending on the law, what you believe, Southern Manifesto. He was one of 3 Southern senators not to. This was the manifesto that basically was against Brown v. Board of Education, saying basically that they were not going to, it was the beginning of massive resistance in the South. Strom Thurmond was basically the and Lyndon Johnson was far more aligned with the New Deal than he was with Jim Crow. Still, in all, he was a white Southerner. The first white Southerner to occupy the White House since James K. Polk in 1845 to 48. Well, I suppose Woodrow Wilson was born in Virginia, but, you know where he's from, right? He wasn't the governor of Virginia, that's for sure. And he didn't run UVA. But Johnson made the most of the situation, that of turning the program of a dead man into that of a martyr. And civil rights was at the very core of his thinking. Only a few days after, 2 days after, in fact, President Kennedy's funeral, the topic came up with him and his aides. What should we push for? He's going to give a speech to Congress, a joint session to Congress. What should we push for? He said civil rights. No, said the aides. Civil rights is much too dangerous. Civil rights will get us, it will cost too much capital for the presidency. To which Lyndon Johnson famously remarked, well, what the hell is the presidency for? And in that address to Congress, on December 27th, 1963, he said, quote, "We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law." Just about as powerful as what we just heard. Except, Lyndon Johnson, unlike John F. Kennedy, as the former Senate Majority Leader, knew his way around Capitol Hill like few presidents, indeed few anybody's before him, and none since. He realized the Civil Rights Bill which Kennedy had sent up to the Hill, which he hadn't done, he thought he'd done precipitously, but that's further than that. He had to get that, the Civil Rights Bill was bottled up in the Rules Committee, the House Rules Committee, whose segregationist chairman, Howard Smith of Virginia, had absolutely no intention of relinquishing it. The best way to get around that, though, was a procedure called a discharge petition. If a majority of the House members sign a discharge petition, a bill is suddenly and unceremoniously taken out of committee. It's not easy to get a discharge petition. But to the chagrin of Smith and his fellow segregationists, President Johnson made getting that petition his own personal crusade. And he got it done. As a leading Southern senator put it, we could have beaten John Kennedy on civil rights, but not Lyndon Johnson. The full Senate soon passed the bill. Johnson signed it into law on July 2nd, 1964, and immediately turned his energies to what would become another landmark statute, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, there's a great debate among me and my colleagues about how much Johnson really mattered in all of this. And a couple of books come out and say really it was more symbolic than anything else. Although, symbols matter a lot in politics. But I think that, I think the other way. I think that Johnson's very comprehensiveness, let alone his ability to understand what was going on, jarred the sluggish and paralyzed capital into action. Already, though, there was more underway. By the time the Civil Rights Bill is signed in July '64, the war on poverty had already been announced. On January 8th, in his very first State of the Union address, Lyndon Johnson declared, quote, unconditional war on poverty in America. And it wasn't just all talk. August 20th, 1964, he signed the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. which created the community action programs, the Job Corps, Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA, the centerpieces of his war on poverty. August 31st was the Food Stamp Act. I mean, it went on and on. Rolling all before it. Getting ready for the election. Meanwhile, two other revolutions were occurring in other parts of the political forest. One of those revolutions was occurring inside the Republican Party. For the better part of the 20th century, the divisions within the Republican Party were defined basically as Main Street versus Wall Street, the Midwest versus the East, the isolationists versus the internationalists. While most of the party aligned with the South versus much of the New Deal, the Eastern establishment was generally dominant through the 1940s into the 1960s. Wendell Willkie. What's great about this audience, you're going to recognize these names. Wendell Willkie, Thomas Dewey, like David Eisenhower, Richard M. Nixon, all prevailed over Mr. Republican, the conservative Republican, Robert Taft of Ohio. Late in the 1950s, though, the Republican Party was being caught up in a shift that was going to affect all of American politics, as a new conservative force began to gather power across what the strategist Kevin Phillips called the Sun Belt, stretching not just from in the Deep South, but all the way to Mexico, Arizona, into California. This was conservatism that had a much harder edge to it than Taft's conservatism, Midwest conservatism. Calling, for example, for confrontation rather than containment in the Cold War. Calling for an actual undoing of much of the New Deal, including Social Security. Calling for a resistance to civil rights on individualist grounds, on anti-government grounds, supposedly. This is where the traditional Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, really began to turn around. And it was because of this new force within the Republican Party that was going to really become what conservatism would be. Is that me? I hope not. Okay.
It's out that way.
It doesn't matter. Those at midnight, it's fine. It was later going to actually spread out to the west and the mountain states. It's basically what the Republican Party is today. The extractive industry and so forth. Their leader was Barry Goldwater of Arizona. And he was the person who was becoming the lightning rod for this new conservatism. And indeed, in 1960, people think from the 64 election, in 1960, his name was placed in nomination at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. And there was quite a demonstration on his behalf. And if I can do this again, I'm going to get the microphone back up here. I want to show you a little bit of, this is Barry Goldwater in 1960 in Chicago. No, Trump. I know, it sounds weird, but it's going to be okay.
Mr. Chairman, delegates to the convention, and fellow Republicans, I respectfully ask the chairman to withdraw my name from nomination. Please. I release my delegation from their pledge to me. And while I'm not a delegate, I would suggest that they give these votes to Richard Nixon. We've had our chance, we've fought our battles, now let's put our shoulders to the wheel of Dick Nixon and push him across the line. Let's not lag back. This country is too important for anyone's feelings. This country and its majesty is too great for any man, be he conservative or liberal, to stay home and not work just because he doesn't agree. someday. Let's get to work.
Well, they got to work, folks. They got to work. F. Clifton White, famously in 1961 in Chicago, set about capturing the Republican Party after Nixon's defeat, capturing the Republican Party for Barry Goldwater and the conservative wing. Set up a New York operation bent on 42nd Street, actually, bent on grassroots organizing to take over the Republican Party machinery. They were helped by Richard Nixon's defeat for the senatorial of the governor's race in California in 1962, Nelson Rockefeller's divorce and remarriage, but the organizing is really what mattered in 1960 to 64. Rockefeller awoke too late what was going on, and Goldwater won the nomination with that Sun Belt conservatism I was talking about front and center. That was one revolution. The second revolution occurred outside the Republican Party. In 1948, you'll recall, when the Democratic Party under Truman embraced civil rights, at least tentatively, when, at that convention when Hubert Humphrey gave his very famous speech as mayor of Minneapolis in favor of the civil rights plank, the Southern delegations walked out, led by Strom Thurmond, to form what was called informally the Dixiecrat Party, which ran Strom Thurmond in 1948. But the Dixiecrats had actually returned to the Democratic Party after the debacle of 48, after Truman won, despite Strom Thurmond. They came back to the Democratic Party. It's interesting to remember that in 1952, Adlai Stevenson, a Princeton man and a great liberal, named to his ticket John Sparkman of Alabama. The next time when he ran in 1956, he named Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Tennessee or Kentucky? I can't remember which.
Tennessee.
I'm here in Tennessee and Kentucky. Thank you very much. And he swept the South, including the Deep South, other than Florida and Texas. The Stevenson ticket carried 70% of the vote in Georgia, both times. So that all the lines were still holding together. It didn't hold together, though, in 1960. John F. Kennedy was a different matter. Lyndon Johnson was a Southerner, but he was thought of as a dangerous liberal down there. And tickets pledged to, either unpledged or pledged to Harry Byrd in Alabama and Mississippi actually prevailed. And there was something of a Dixiecrat revival in 1960. Well, by late 1963, that Dixiecrat revival had coalesced around its hero, Governor George C. Wallace of Alabama. You remember that it was George C. Wallace who stood there in the schoolhouse door on June 11th, 1963 with Nick Katzenbach, but he had already become pretty notorious. And I'm going to need the microphone again. This is not a terribly good tape, but it's the best one I could find. This is George C. Wallace at his inauguration in January of 1963. Well, as it happened, I mean, he always emerged as the anti-Kennedy party from the South. In mid-November 1963, about 5 days before the assassination, Wallace declared that he was entering the Democratic primaries. Kennedy was dead. He was going to run against Lyndon Johnson, but he ran anyway. Ended up getting 1/3 of the vote in Wisconsin, Indiana, and Maryland, before deciding to vacate the race in order to give the GOP a clear shot in the South at Lyndon Johnson. But it was not over. There was, in fact, prior to the Republican National Convention in San Francisco, which nominated Goldwater, Wallace and his aides, Bill Jones and Seymour Trammell, actually met at the Jefferson Davis Hotel in Montgomery with the Alabama Republican leader, James D. Martin, to talk about a possible alliance. Wallace and his aides were trying to determine if Goldwater, who was about to become the GOP presidential nominee, and who, as senator from Arizona, had voted against the Civil Rights Act in 1964 on libertarian and constitutional grounds, they were wondering whether he would advocate a repeal of the law were he to be elected president, particularly the public accommodations and equal employment sections. Jones indicated that his man Wallace agreed with Goldwater's anti-communist stance, his confrontationist stance, but opposed the Republicans' proposals to make Social Security a voluntary program. The interesting part about the segregation of the South, they managed to be both racist and pro-New Deal on certain issues. It's just important to remember that, especially on economic issues. Jones stressed that Wallace had sacrificed his own presidential ambitions that year in order to allow for a direct GOP challenge to Johnson. It was later disclosed that Wallace proposed at the meeting with Martin to switch parties if he could be named as Goldwater's running mate. The designation later given to William of New York. Goldwater reportedly rejected the overture because of Wallace's lack of strength outside the Deep South. Still, the GOP managed to get its clear shot as unpledged delegates. A clear shot, there were unpledged delegates running on the Democratic side in Alabama. This mixture of the Sun Belt, Goldwater, plus pro-segregation, Wallace, foretold a new alignment in the Republican Party and indeed a new alignment in American politics. And so we come to the election of 1964, which we can see pretty much right away. It's silent. This is the silent portion of the video, of the AV stuff today. These are the results for 1964, right? Blue and red. It's the same advantage now. Right? You can see where Goldwater ran where it's red. I mean, he captured Arizona, but otherwise he just basically captured the Deep South, which is going to be a major realignment in America. This hadn't happened before. This is a complete reversal of everything that had been in American politics since the Civil War. That has been reversed in the election of 1964. It was still a little early for the Western Sun Belt. California in particular, they would have to actually nominate California before they actually captured California fully. But California, Texas, Lyndon Johnson was going to get his way in Texas. Doesn't really matter. But Texas is ripe for the falling because there's a conservative John Tower been elected to the Senate. I mean, Texas is trending Republican, conservative Republican. But this is the heart of it. This is the beginnings of all that's going to happen. Different story in the Deep South. Goldwater swept the 5 Jim Crow states from South Carolina through Louisiana, although he didn't get Florida. Goldwater won 87% of the vote in Mississippi that year. 87% of the vote. Nearly 70% in Alabama. Still, in the rest of the country, Johnson crushed Goldwater. Well more than 65% in most of the northeastern states. Overall, Johnson won 61.05% of the popular vote, which is more of a larger percentage than FDR had won in 1936. Indeed, it remains the highest popular vote percentage in American history. The next day, in the New York Times, James Reston wrote, quote, Barry Goldwater not only lost the presidential election yesterday, but the conservative cause as well. He has wrecked his party for a long time to come. I'm going to mean to Scotty Reston. History will play quick side. Looking out into 1965, there's every reason to believe that that was the case. Happy days were here again. The Democrats. After Selma comes the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All of the big, with these huge majorities in the Congress, Johnson can get, he basically has a blank check. Medicare, Medicaid, all the things we associate, most of the things we associate with the Great Society, all were accomplished in 1965, the beginning of 1966. But what looked like the ultimate triumph would prove to be, in fact, liberalism's last hurrah. But for a long period in the wilderness that lasted until 1992, and some would even say until 2008. Now there's a familiar argument about this, a familiar interpretation, familiar explanation for all this, which is simply that there was a backlash. That white Americans objected to what the overreach of what they saw as the overreach of the Great Society. Johnson had gone too far. The mobilization of white conservatism in the North as well as the South began in the 1966 midterm elections, which robbed the Democrats of their commanding control of both the House and the Senate, later played upon by Richard M. Nixon in his famous Southern strategy of 1968. In other words, white Americans just couldn't take Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. There's something to that, but it's also very unique. Because even as Johnson's Democrats were on the verge of sweeping to great victory, events were occurring that would cause the rapid disruption of that gigantic Democratic coalition. It was going to come undone. It wasn't so much that, that Johnson had gone too far, it's that political things inside the coalition were going to ruin it. And I will concentrate. The real turning point, the real argument I'm making here is it's the month of August 1964. It all happens in August 1964. On August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox engaged North Vietnamese gunboats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Captain George Stephen Morrison, who's the son, who later became the lead singer for The Doors. You didn't know that, did you? Stranger than fiction. Yes, Jim Morrison's father was the guy who was commander of the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, another engagement was reported. They were probably shooting at whales. Then Lyndon Johnson later said, we only later learned that from the very beginning, the United States had initiated the fire. On August 4th, probably nothing happened at all. Even Robert McNamara, 30 years later, mind you, admitted this, that nothing really had happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. But at the time, Congress it was the event that led Congress to give Johnson a joint resolution with the right to involve the United States with military action in Vietnam without a declaration of war, opposed by only 2 members of the Senate. Well, you know where that's going. And that war is going to shatter the Democratic Party. It's going to rip it in 2 or 3. 3 weeks after the Gulf of Tonkin, the Democrats gathered in Atlantic City to nominate Lyndon Johnson. There was great suspense about who his vice president would be. Some thought he would name Robert F. Kennedy as vice president. Those people who thought that didn't know either Lyndon Johnson or Robert F. Kennedy very well. But, Kennedy was such a, look, it was still very raw. He ended up, of course, naming Hubert H. Humphrey, the great liberal. The man who had marshaled through, going back to 1948, he'd been a symbol of democratic liberalism on civil rights. He had been the floor manager, really, for the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. Certainly, Lyndon Johnson was sending a message. He was doubling down on what he had done by naming Hubert Humphrey. But there were 2 events at that convention which also spelled out danger for the Democratic Party. The last evening of the convention was given to a film made about the life of President Kennedy. The person who introduced that film, Johnson wanted Robert Kennedy as far away from Atlantic City as possible. But that was impossible. He couldn't do that. So he gave Kennedy a kind of, what he thought was a sort of, second-rate slot, third-rate slot, introducing a movie about his brother. Well, Robert F. Kennedy gets up. Before he can even open his mouth, people are cheering and crying and cheering and crying, and it lasted 22 minutes. before he can say, I'm not good film, but Kennedy can say, Mr. Chairman, they won't let him shut up. He looks strict. I mean, if you remember that, I remember this actually. He looked like he was about to break down, as you could imagine he would. And in that speech, he concluded by quoting Shakespeare from Romeo and Juliet, talking about his brother, and when he shall die, come up with the little stars, and the world shall worship the heaven so bright and forget the garish sun. Well, Johnson, not going to forget that. This was his show. Robert Kennedy had showed him up. This is going to all culminate in 1968. One side of what was going on, although it would require a lot. I mean, it would require Vietnam, would require a number of developments. But beneath a lot of that was the fundamental hatred between Robert F. Kennedy and Andrew James Johnson. But the more dramatic events actually occurred. They were less obvious, but they were actually played out on national television. That summer was the summer of the Mississippi, Mississippi Summer Project for voter registration in Mississippi. A big fight among the people in COFO, and but to bring the college students down, the white college students from up here, they decided to do it. And, as we know, 3 of those civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Dickie Schwerner, were murdered. Murdered on June 21st, 22nd, only 10 days after that speech, shortly after Medgar Evers had been murdered. Their bodies were found on August 4th. So we're back to the month of August 1964. Those 3 bodies are found. The culmination, though, because the project kept on going, the culmination of Mississippi Summer was the election of an integrated slate of delegates to the Democratic National Convention, the so-called Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Those delegates claimed the seats for Mississippi in Atlantic City, on the grounds that the official Mississippi delegation had been elected in violation of the party's rules because blacks had been systematically excluded from voting in the primaries and participating in the precinct and county caucuses and the state convention, whereas the MFDP delegates had all been elected in strict compliance with party rules. The party's liberal leaders supported an even division of the seats between the 2 delegations, half from the segregationists, half from the MFDP. But Johnson was concerned, maybe a psycho is strong, that while the regular Democrats would probably vote for Gold War anyway, rejecting them would lose him the South. Why Lyndon Johnson thought he was going to win the South in 1964, after he'd already told Bill Moyers that he lost the South for a generation after signing the Civil Rights Bill, can't adequately explain that. But he certainly did not want to see this happen, in part because he was being shown up on TV at his convention. Eventually, Hubert Humphrey, Walter Reuther, black civil rights leaders, including Roy Wilkins and Barry Rustin, worked out a compromise. 2 of the 68 MFDP delegates chosen by Johnson would be made at-large delegates. Actually, Johnson chose 1 black guy and 1 white guy. There was a white guy. There was 1 white guy there, he chose him. They call it optics today. Would be made at-large delegates, and the remainder would be non-voting guests of the convention. The regular Mississippi delegation, and this is not a small matter, would be required to pledge to support the party ticket. Now, in Mississippi, even as a Democrat, if you're going in saying you would have to support the party ticket, that was a big deal. Furthermore, that no Democratic convention would accept a delegation chosen in future in a discriminatory poll. The MFDP's lawyer, Joseph Rao, initially refused the deal, but eventually urged the MFDP to accept it. But the MFDP delegates refused, because by accepting the official all-white Mississippi delegation, the party validated a process in which they had been systematically excluded. They felt that because the MFDP had conducted their delegation selection according to the rules, they should be seated, and not just with hoping 2 at-large delegates. As Fannie Lou Hamer, there's a whole other story where I can tell about Fannie Lou Hamer and her testimony, you may remember it, said, we didn't come all the way from Mississippi for no 2 seats. Now, LBJ was not going to get much out of this in the end. because it was a harbinger of what was to come with the Old South, or the White South. Many white delegates from Mississippi and Alabama refused to sign any pledge, and they simply left the convention. In all, 43 of the 53 members of the Alabama delegation refused to pledge their support to the national ticket. They were denied seating, and they went back home. But there was also bitterness, real bitterness, as many civil rights activists were deeply offended by the convention's outcome. This was the end of politics for a whole swatch of the civil rights movement, particularly young people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. As one of their leaders at the time, now Representative John Lewis, who was by no means, he was quite militant, but he was not a violent man at all. As John Lewis said at the time, or later on, we had played by the rules, done everything we were supposed to do, had played the game exactly as required, had arrived at the doorstep, and found the door slammed in our face. To this, any cooperation with the White House, any idea of working with these people died in a large, substantial section of the civil rights movement. Long-term disillusionment. True, after Selma, the beatings at Selma in March 1965, Johnson delivered the Voting Rights Act, gave his famous speech before Congress where he spoke the words, "We shall overcome," and caused Martin Luther King to weep. But only 1 week after the Voting Rights Act was signed, the rebellion, or whatever you want to call it, the uprising, the violence in Watts in Los Angeles. 1 week later, the civil rights movement was at a crossroads. The Voting Rights Act actually had been a great triumph. But what now? Where do we go now? Are there any more Mississippis or any more Alabamas? Martin King eventually decided to move north. But northern racism had to be confronted. But northern racism, particularly in the city of Chicago, particularly in the area called Cicero, had to be confronted. This was a noble stance, but it was one that helped turn northern racism against the civil rights movement. All of a sudden, people were not thinking it was such a great idea. And who is this Lyndon Johnson anyway? And who are these Democrats that riled northern whites as well? Meanwhile, the distrust came out of Atlantic City with the MFDP, did split the movement. And it's by 1966 that Stokely Carmichael, who was actually misrepresented in the play that I mentioned earlier, but never mind, he gives his famous Black Power, not speech, he's just shouting Black Power in the city. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee dumped white people altogether. They were a separatist. It was a much more separatist moment. Malcolm X suddenly becomes more of a hero. The civil rights movement is going through real changes. What had been into the solid ranks of unions, churches, white and black, was now shattered. Well, if not shattered, it was certainly challenged. So, August 1968, Vietnam and civil rights. All was going to undo the United Democratic Party that would sweep Johnson to victory only a few months later. The seeds were already planted. They would really, it would all come to a violent denouement in 1968 at the Chicago Convention. And yet even then, Hubert H. Humphrey, running for president, after Johnson had moved out, after Robert F. Kennedy had been murdered, after Martin Luther King had been murdered, he barely lost the popular vote to Richard M. Nixon. It was more lopsided in the Electoral College, but it was very, very, very close in the popular vote. One wonders if something could have been patched together in 1968, and if the Democrats could have barely held, and what would have happened after that. I suspect nothing would have changed all that much. It would have been a delay rather than a change. But what of the Republicans? That party that had been destroyed in 1964. The party that Scott Reston said would never recover. Had it been destroyed? In the aftermath of Goldwater's crushing defeat, the old establishment in the Republican Party came back. All of Goldwater's people have been appointed, Dean Birch and others have been appointed to the party hierarchy. They're getting going. They're getting it done. The establishment comes back into power. Richard M. Nixon was Mr. Establishment, if nothing else. He'd been disgraced in 1962, but he comes back very hard. In 1966 in particular, he campaigns vociferously for Republican congressional candidates and senatorial candidates in the midterms, and enjoys something of a great comeback on to 1968. But of course, that was not going to be the future of the Republican Party, as Nixon's crimes and Watergate nearly destroyed the Republicans all over again. There was a time in 1974 where the Republican National Committee was actually debating whether to change the name of the party, as if that was the problem. But you know, it did not look good. And all those Democrats came back in, the so-called Watergate babies. Look at the dawn of a new liberalism. You see, it had all been mistaken. All of it. Then comes Jimmy Carter. Democrats are deeply divided again. Well, I don't have to start with the whole story. It was different. It was a false dawn of liberalism, to say the least, coming out of Watergate. The Republicans, meanwhile, managed to pull together their battered mainstream, and it really had been battered. I mean, George H.W. Bush was about the last man standing in support of Nixon. But they managed to hold it together. But in time, and it would take time, they had to go through some convulsions in 1976, but by 1980, that battered mainstream would be able to combine with a now dominant, Dixie Sun Belt, and begin to think about enlarging their following into 1980. But this really brings us all back to 1964 once again. Not to August, true, but to October. With a week to go before the election, and let me need the microphone one last time. With a week to go before the election, the faltering Goldwater campaign launched a last-minute, pre-recorded television endorsement ad from California. It did not turn the tide, but it did raise $1 million, and it basically launched a political campaign. The ad was entitled, "A Time for Choosing." I'm going to try and get it up right now. Come on, folks. There we go.
When the government tells you you're depressed, lie down and be depressed. We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one. So they're going to solve all the problems of human misery through government and government planning. Well, now, if government planning and welfare had the answer, and they've had almost 30 years of it, shouldn't we expect government to read the score to us once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us about the decline each year in the number of people needing help, the reduction in the need for public housing? But the reverse is true. Each year the need grows greater, the program grows greater. We were told 4 years ago that 17 million people went to bed hungry each night. Well, that was probably true. They were all on a diet.
That's 1964. And that, rather than the triumphant Johnson campaign, was the harbinger of the future. And though much has changed since 1980, let alone since 1964, I submit that we are still living with the effects of that turning point in 1964-65. But that is the subject for another lecture.
Professor Willits has agreed
Thank you, by the way.
to
Thank you.
take some questions. We have a few minutes, actually.
Sure. Yes, sir.
How do you view the role of the Tea Party in its rise, and when will it fall?
And some with a certain degree of expectation of desire. I think Tea Party's already in trouble, actually. I mean, the Republican mainstream in Chamber of Commerce, the Republican Party seems to be asserting itself, seems to have realized that they are endangering the party's well-being if they keep submitting to these guys. But then again, John Boehner is not exactly, Sam Rayburn. John Boehner may be the most pathetic Speaker of the House in all of United States history. And that is really acceptable. The Tea Party comes out of another whole process that's occurred since, well, had Al Gore won the election, had the Supreme Court not elected George W. Bush in 2000, well, by one vote, right? I mean, that's not a polemical statement, that's just truth. It has the added advantage of being true. Something strange happened, because actually the Republicans had elected a person who came out of the Republican establishment. He was a scion of the Republican establishment. He was George H.W. Bush's son. However, he was Texas, he was slightly different, he had Cheney around him. We had the Bush administration. But remember about the Bush administration in the last 2 years. I mean, I stuck my neck out in 2006 by writing an article for that august scholarly magazine, Rolling Stone, asking the historical question of whether George W. Bush was the worst president in American history. Now, I said, there's still 2 years to go. Those last 2 years are rather different. He got rid of Cheney. He dumped Cheney, basically. I mean, Cheney's around, but he's marginalized. And he had already tried the pharmaceutical business. He goes for immigration reform. That's not good. He goes for TARP. When the economy falls apart, instead of letting the economy fall apart, he actually saved it, or tried to save it. That really was not good. So the Tea Party actually begins in protests against Bush's stand on TARP. So it's the further radicalization of the Republican Party that had really begun with Newt Gingrich in 1994. And Gingrich really set off an entire process. But it's a bit like the Jacobins in the French Revolution. I mean, eventually there's one convulsion after another, and everybody's just moving their heads. Except it's like the Reign of Terror without Thermidor. So it just continues on and on and on. And you end up with what we had during the debt ceiling crisis, which was literally a small rump of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives threatening to ruin the world economy if they didn't get their way. I think that was their debacle. I suspect that was their debacle, but we'll see. I mean, look at the Republican field for 2016, the presidential field. I mean, you have to say that Rand Paul looks pretty strong. Now, Rand Paul is a libertarian. He's not exactly Tea Party, but he's pretty Tea Party. So, who else? Unless Jeb Bush comes in, once again, the Bush family to the rescue. It's an historical fact that between 1952 and 2004, right, except for one election, 1964, the election we're talking about, either a Bush, a Nixon, or a Dole was on the Republican Party ticket. 50 years, 3 families. They talk about dynasty and the Clintons, forget it. If you're doing it, do that movie, that TV show Dynasty, it's starring George H.W. Bush, Dick Nixon, and one of the Doles. But I don't know the answer. I think that what it does typify this continued radicalization of the party, which I think is really what's caused the polarization over the last 5, 6, 8 years. Well, since Obama got in. But it was already there before that. It was just that it became a horrible start after the revolt against Bush. But remember, it began as a revolt not against Obama. Well, they don't like Obama. But it began as a revolt against Bush. So it's an internal fight, it's an internal war within the Republican Party, which Democrats ought to be very happy about. Yes, sir.
Why didn't Nixon pick Goldwater as his running mate?
In 1964?
Or 1960?
Or 1960? Well, 1960 was his real, I mean, you wouldn't get this from the clip, but his real competition was Nelson Rockefeller in 1960. So basically, he and Rockefeller cut a deal, which was called the Treaty of Fifth Avenue. Why wasn't the Treaty of Park Avenue? Well, it's because that's where Rockefeller's office was. It was cut in his office on Fifth Avenue. But basically, Nixon was going to get the nomination, but Rockefeller would get the platform and would have a lot more to say in the Nixon administration had he been elected than he might have otherwise. It was a deal worked out. So he was really working with Rockefeller in 1960. Not for nothing, who does he pick? A Massachusetts liberal Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge. But he's going in that direction. Goldwater is coming out of nowhere. I mean, if you listen to the NBC, Huntley and Brinkley, they're talking about this strange guy, Barry Goldwater, who's coming out of nowhere, and he has all the support, and maybe he's going to become the new Robert Taft, but isn't it weird? So he was a kind of newcomer. He was uncharted territory, whereas Rockefeller and Nixon, they were in the struggle. 64, by 64, the Republican Party has been taken over by the Goldwaterites. So they're going to nominate for the vice presidency William Miller, a completely unknown congressman from New York, who later ends up in a credit card ad saying, "Do you know who I am?" And Miller was completely safe, right, because he was inoffensive. He didn't add a thing to the ticket. I don't think he tracked the ticket. The ticket was all about Goldwater. So that was the name of that tune. But Nixon's comeback is extraordinary. I mean, but it also tells you something about the Republican Party. It's not just that Dick Nixon is the most tenacious politician in modern history, for better or worse, but the Republican Party had this kind of dynastic side to it. The establishment there was really getting very turgid. And he was going to be, challenged again in 1968 by whom? Who was the great challenger to Richard Nixon in 1968 at the Republican convention in Miami? Is Ronald Reagan. It's Ronald Reagan's first attempt for president. It's kind of amateurish, not very, sophisticated, but already coming off of that speech that you saw, he is being touted as the new man. Yes, sir.
In your introductory remarks, you talked about zigs and zags. And I was wondering if there are any particular zags that you can identify where an action by someone would have changed the course of developments that you outlined in your talk.
Right. First, obviously, the big one is they put the bubble on the limousine in Dallas. They put the bubble on the limousine. John F. Kennedy's not assassinated. And that's probably the most important single event in American political history since World War II, anyway. I'm not saying it's a turning point, because things had a turn, but I think that was dramatic as well as traumatic. So that's one big thing. There was a zig that just was. But further down the line, the MSDB crisis, had Johnson handled that better, it would have been different. I think some others that I talked about, where things could have gone different. The Gulf of Tonkin. That's the biggest one of all. If he hadn't been so worried about losing the South, if he hadn't been so worried about, it wasn't just him. I just saw an interview with President Kennedy in September or October of '63. Well, he's saying we're very concerned about the loss of China. We can't do what they did back then in 1949, blah, 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 blah. They're still thinking in that mindset of having to, watch out for what Lyndon Johnson said, the great beast in American politics is the right wing. So, no Gulf of Tonkin. You wind down the war, everything's different. Yeah. So that's the biggest, those are the two big zigs and zags, I'd say. Yeah. Yes.
Perhaps one more question.
We'll talk about Iraq in a minute. Yes.
Realizing that we're still in the Obama administration, it's dangerous to ask a historian to project the future.
No, I do it all the time.
We've had 5 years of it. So how do you think historians are going to look as to how liberal do you think the Obama administration is going to look in the future?
How liberal?
Yeah.
The Obama administration did one extraordinary thing, which cannot be ever forgotten, which is getting health care for us. And that was very important. Now, did he do it well? Not perfectly. Did he do it? He almost blew it on health care. But he did it. And it's, I don't care what the Republicans are screaming about, that's going to be a success. It's already becoming a success. They can scream about Obamacare all they want. That's a loser for them. If the Republicans think they're going to win on the basis of Obamacare, they're going to come, which is why they're already starting to try to find something else. So I think that that is going to be a landmark achievement. It does depend, however, and indeed, Barack Obama's entire reputation depends on who is elected in 2016. The Democrats elected in 2016, he's going to look good. Republican comes in, he's dead. It's really that simple. Republican comes in with a Republican Congress, it's all gone. And so Barack Obama will remember as being the first African-American president of United States history, and that's it. Liberal, not liberal, I mean, it's just not going to matter. I think that a lot of people, and I was not one of them, but a lot of people imagined that then Senator Obama was much more, I don't know. But they thought the same thing about Bobby Kennedy, too. I mean, I love Bobby Kennedy, but he was not a flaming liberal. I don't, Barack Obama was not a flaming liberal. But, he campaigned well. He campaigned to attract a certain kind of audience, which he had to get for the primaries to beat her. And he did it, and was very successful. He nearly lost the election. If it hadn't been for Bear Stearns in September 15th, he probably would have lost, even with Sarah Palin running against him. The polls were going in that direction. The polls were, they were not good. But then it was a collapse. And so, at that point, I suspect I could have beaten John McCain. Which, that's what I'm saying. So I think but I think there's people have there's sort of the disillusionment with, for those of us who were never illusioned about President Obama, it's not that difficult to understand. I love it when people come up and tell me,